She stood alone at the edge of the ballroom while her husband kept his back to her as though she were nothing more than a shadow the chandeliers had forgotten to erase. The music rose, silk whispered against silk, and laughter drifted around Cordelia Thorne, the new Countess of Ravensmere, in a language she had never been taught to speak. He had not looked at her once all evening. Not once. The guests noticed. They always noticed. Behind painted fans and lifted glasses, the whispers began their familiar and cruel little dance. The poor creature, they murmured. He can hardly bear the sight of her. They say she and her father arranged the whole affair. They say she trapped him. Cordelia's gloved fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, but her face did not move. 3 months of marriage had taught her that composure was the only armor she owned. Inside that armor, something small and hopeful was quietly bleeding. She had worn cornflower blue tonight. He had told her once long ago, and in another life, that the color reminded him of the sky over Somerset after rain. She had folded that memory away and carried it like a warm coal through a cold winter. Tonight, she had taken it out and worn it for him. He had not even turned his head. What no one in that glittering room could have guessed, least of all the Earl himself, was that the quiet woman in blue already held the first thread of a secret that would unravel everything they believed they knew. Lord Hartfield's ballroom was the finest in that quarter of London, all gilt and candle glow, and the cream of the season had gathered beneath its painted ceiling. Gabriel Thorne, the Earl of Ravensmere, stood near the far windows in conversation with 2 elderly peers about the troubling news from the provincial banks. He was a tall man, dark of hair, with a face that might have been handsome had it ever chosen to soften. It did not soften now. It had not softened toward his wife in 90 days. Cordelia watched the back of his coat and let the noise of the room wash over her. She had learned the trick of it the way a woman learns to stand very still when a wasp is near. If she did not move, if she did not hope, then the sting could not find her. When a passing matron caught her eye and offered a look of thin, delighted pity, Cordelia inclined her head as gracefully as if she had been complimented. At last, she set her glass upon a footman's tray and slipped from the room. She did not trust herself to hold the tears much longer, and she would not weep where they could see. She found a quiet corridor lined with cold marble busts, and there she pressed her hand to her mouth until the tightness in her throat eased. It was a familiar exercise. She had grown skilled at it. 3 months earlier, she had become Cordelia Thorne beneath the great arches of St. James's in Piccadilly, with half of fashionable London crowded into the pews to watch. She had worn ivory silk and her mother's pearls, and her heart had been a wild and frightened thing, caught between duty and a dream she scarcely dared to name. She had loved Gabriel Thorne since she was 17 years old, since the night he danced with her once at a country assembly in Somerset, and told her with a smile she never forgot that her eyes were the color of cornflowers after rain. She remembered that assembly still remembered it as one remembers a single warm room glimpsed through a window on a bitter night. She had been a girl of 17 in a made-over gown, the daughter of a baronet whose fortunes were already sliding quietly toward ruin, and she had expected nothing of the evening but the pleasure of the music and a glass of weak punch. She had not expected him. Gabriel Thorne had been a young man then, too grave beyond his years and a little apart from the laughing crowd, and when he had crossed the floor and asked her to dance, she had been so astonished that she had nearly refused him out of sheer confusion. But she had danced with him, and somewhere in the turning of that dance he had looked down at her upturned face in the candlelight and told her quite simply and without any flattery in it that her eyes were the color of cornflowers after rain. No one had ever said such a thing to her before. No one had ever looked at her as though she were worth the saying of it. She had gone home that night and lain awake until dawn, and she had carried the memory of it whole and shining through the 4 gray years that followed. She had carried that small flame for 4 long years. She had been 21 when her father announced the engagement, and she had wept, not from sorrow, but from a joy so sharp it felt very close to pain. She had believed with the whole of her foolish and hopeful heart that the grave young man from the assembly had remembered her, had wanted her, had chosen her above all the polished daughters of grander houses. She had built in the weeks before the wedding a whole future out of that single remembered dance. She had imagined the two of them growing old among the Somerset hills, and she had imagined him telling her again some quiet evening years hence that her eyes were the color of cornflowers, and she had been happier in those weeks than she had ever been in her life. She had believed it until their wedding night. Gabriel had come to her sitting room in the London house that evening, still in his formal black, and he had looked at her with such cold and weary disappointment that the flame inside her guttered low. He did not sit. He did not take her hand. "I will not pretend this is a love match," he had said. "You and your father have made quite certain that it cannot be. I will provide for you. I will protect your name, and I will give you the title of Countess. But do not look to me for more than that, for you will not find it." She had tried to speak. She had tried to ask what he meant, for she understood nothing of it, but he had already turned and walked from the room. The door closed behind him with a small and final sound that seemed to go on echoing in her chest for weeks afterward. She had sat alone in that sitting room for a long time after he had gone, still in her wedding finery, her mother's pearls cool against her throat, and she had turned his words over and over in her mind like a stone she could not put down. "You and your father have made quite certain that it cannot be." What could he mean by it? She had made certain of nothing. She had only loved him and said yes when her father brought her the news of the engagement, and let herself be dressed and driven to the church and married with a heart so full she had feared it would burst. She could find no crime in any of it, and yet he had looked at her as at an enemy. Long after the candles had burned low, she had risen at last and taken off the pearls and folded away the ivory silk, and she had understood dimly that the marriage she had dreamed of for 4 years had ended before it had properly begun on the very night it was made. In the days that followed, Cordelia learned the shape of her new life. Ravensmere Court in Somerset was magnificent, all ancient honey-colored stone and sweeping green lawns, but she came to understand that it was also a mausoleum of silences. Gabriel was courteous at breakfast and distant at dinner and absent in every hour between. He rode out early. He shut himself in his study with his correspondence and his ledgers. When they were obliged to appear together at some neighboring house, he offered her his arm and nothing else. She tried. That was the part she would remember with the sharpest ache in later years, how earnestly she had tried. She learned his preferences from the housekeeper, Mrs. Thistlewood, a stout and watchful woman who had served the family for 30 years. She learned how he took his coffee and which chair by the library fire he favored, and which of the long garden walks he preferred at dusk. She left small offerings in his path, a sprig of rosemary upon his writing desk, one morning gathered from the kitchen garden, and a slim volume of poetry she thought might please him. He never mentioned either. She learned other things in those first weeks, small and wounding things. She learned that he did not care to be spoken to at breakfast beyond the barest civility, and so she stopped speaking and ate her toast in silence while he read his letters. She learned that if she came into a room where he sat, he would find within a few minutes some reason to rise and go elsewhere, and so she grew careful about which room she entered and when. She learned to read the closing of his study door as other women read the weather, and to know from the particular firmness of it whether he would be seen at dinner or would send word that he dined out. She was mistress of a great house, and could order the killing of a sheep or the beating of a carpet with a word. And yet she found that she arranged her whole day around the movements of a man who did not wish to see her the way a small boat arranges itself around a rock in a river. Once she gathered her courage and knocked upon the study door. "I thought we might take tea together, my lord," she said when he bid her enter. He looked up from his papers, and for a single heartbeat his expression seemed to soften, as though some door within him had opened a bare inch. Then it shut. "I am occupied," he said. She nodded and withdrew and closed the door with great care, and it was in that moment that hope first began to flicker into something frail and wounded. She stood a long while in the corridor, with her hand still upon the latch. She could hear the scratch of his pen resume behind the wood, steady and indifferent, and she understood that she had become a caller at her own hearth, a guest who might be received or turned away according to his humor. That night, she wrote nothing in her journal. She only sat by the window of her room and watched the moon travel across the Somerset sky and wondered what crime she could possibly have committed to earn such a punishment. She could think of none. She had loved him. That was the whole of it. She had loved him, and it had somehow made him hate her. The house was very large and very quiet, and she was very young, and she began in those first weeks to learn the particular loneliness of a woman who is surrounded by servants and has no one at all. A month into the marriage, Cordelia overheard the words that broke the last of her innocence. The evening had been mild, and she had gone into the garden after dusk, drawn by the sweetness of the jasmine that climbed the south wall. The gravel paths were pale in the fading light, and she walked them slowly, glad of the air, until she came near the open window of Gabriel's study and heard voices within. She would have passed on. She had no wish to eavesdrop upon her own husband, but then she heard her father's name and her own, and her feet would not carry her another step. The second voice belonged to Josiah Crane, the steward who managed the whole of the Ravensmere estates and who had been Gabriel's trusted man since before Gabriel came into the title. Crane was a lean and careful person of middle years, soft of speech, with a way of seeming always to be in agreement with whoever last spoke. Cordelia had thought little of him. She would learn in time to think a great deal more. "You cannot blame yourself forever, my lord," Crane was saying in that low and soothing manner of his. "Sir Reginald is a gambler and a schemer. He caught you in a corner from which no honorable man could have escaped. You did what the estate required." Gabriel's laugh was hollow and without any warmth in it. And she played her part to perfection, did she not? The modest young miss with the cornflower eyes, so gentle, so surprised by her good fortune. All the while her father held my paper and threatened to call the debt and ruin the tenants who depend upon this land. Do not ask me to admire the performance, Crane. I have watched it every day for a month, and it sickens me. Cordelia stood rooted upon the gravel. The night had grown suddenly cold. Her father had held a debt over Gabriel. Her father had threatened him. She had known nothing of it, nothing at all. She had believed with all her trusting heart that Gabriel had asked for her because he remembered a girl at a country assembly and had carried the memory as tenderly as she had carried hers. But no. To Gabriel, she was not the girl from the assembly. She was a piece of the trap. She was the smiling bait upon her father's hook. She did not confront him. What she asked herself later would have been the use. He would not believe her. A woman who declared her own innocence to a man already certain of her guilt would only seem to him to be lying with a prettier face. So she carried her ruined understanding back into the house, and she buried her tears in her pillow that night. And in the morning she walked into breakfast with a smile that cost her more than any coin she had ever spent. He did not look up from his newspaper. She had meant at first to write to her father and demand the truth of it. She had gone so far as to take out paper and trim a pen. But before she could set down a single line, a letter arrived from her younger brother Theodore, and it stopped her hand. Theo was but 16, a bright and gentle boy, and the whole of the family's remaining hope was fixed upon him. He was to go up to Oxford in the autumn of the following year, and the arrangement for his fees and his keep there had been settled. Cordelia now understood through the very man who held their father's debts. If the scandal of those debts came into the open, if she made any noise that drew the world's eye toward the affairs of the House of Ashcombe, the arrangement would collapse, and Theo's future would collapse with it. Their father, when at last she wrote to him, did not deny the debt. He confessed it in shame and begged her for the sake of her brother to hold her peace. Say nothing, he wrote, and endure. It is the one gift you can still give this family. There was another reason for her silence, quieter and harder, and Cordelia came to it slowly over the days that followed. She was a married woman now, and under the law. She was no longer a person who could act or speak or hold anything in her own name. Her husband was her voice in the eyes of the world, and her husband would not hear her. A wife who protested her innocence had nothing to offer but words, and words from a woman already believed to be false were worth precisely nothing. If she was ever to clear her name, she saw she would need more than protest. She would need proof, something written and sealed that no one could dismiss as a pretty lie. She had no such thing. And so she did the only thing left to a woman with no voice and no proof and a brother to protect. She was quiet. But she did not remain idle, and this was the beginning of the change in her, though neither she nor anyone at Ravensmere marked it at the time. If she could not have her husband, she resolved she would at least have a life. She began in small and deliberate ways to build one. She stopped leaving rosemary upon his desk. She stopped watching for his glance at dinner. She stopped waiting in the drawing room in the evenings for a companion who never came. And into the hours that this refusal freed, she poured herself. She went out among the tenant cottages that lay scattered across the estate, and she learned the names of the families there, and the names of their children, and the particular troubles of each household. She found that old Mrs. Pardew's cough grew worse in the damp, and that the Hobbs family had lost 2 lambs to the wet spring, and that the widow Sallow could no longer afford the poor rate that the parish demanded of her. Cordelia learned the workings of the parish relief, the way the overseers doled out bread and coal to those the law counted deserving, and she learned where the law fell short and quietly made up the difference from her own small allowance. The tenants who had at first been wary of the cold earl's cold bride began to watch for her coming and to save up their small news for her. There was one afternoon that autumn that she would remember always. She had walked out to the far cottages with a basket of things from the still room, and she had come upon the widow Sallow sitting in the cold by a dead hearth, too proud to beg and too poor to buy the coal. The parish would not give her, for the overseer had struck her name from the list of the deserving on some small point of the settlement laws that Cordelia did not then understand. Cordelia had sat down with the old woman and learned the whole of it, the tangle of parish and settlement and the hard reckoning by which the law decided who might be helped and who might be let freeze. And she had gone home and read what she could find upon the matter. And the next morning she had gone quietly to the overseer herself and made an arrangement, and the widow Sallow had coal that winter. It was a very small thing, but it taught Cordelia that she was not after all entirely without power in the world. There were people she could help. There were wrongs she could set a little to rights, and a woman who has learned that she can act even in small things is a different creature from the woman who believes she can only be acted upon. She discovered, too, a library in the East Wing that had been shut up for a generation, its shelves gray with dust and its windows shrouded. She spent long afternoons there, coaxing the shutters open, wiping the leather spines clean, losing herself in histories and novels and old books of travel. She found in the still room a store of dried herbs and forgotten receipts, and she set herself to learn their uses. How calendula soothed a broken skin, and how feverfew eased an aching head. She kept a little book of these things receipts copied out in her fair hand, this herb for that ailment, this steeping for that ache, and she found in the keeping of it a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with her husband at all. It was hers. It answered to her. A tincture did not care whether the Earl of Ravensmere looked at her across the breakfast table and a fever broke or did not break according to the care that was given it, and not according to the coldness of any man. And there was a great steadiness to be found in tending to things that could be mended by patience and attention. The cook's daughter fell ill of a fever that spring, and Cordelia sat with her 3 nights running and read to her and made her a posset and bathed her hot forehead. And when at last the fever broke and the child slept easy, the cook wept and caught Cordelia's hand and could not thank her enough, and Cordelia went back to her cold and splendid rooms that dawned more truly content than she had been since her wedding day. By the 2nd month of her marriage, Cordelia had built a small and quiet life inside the shadow of a marriage that did not exist. She smiled at the footman when he brought her tea. She planted a cutting garden behind the conservatory larkspur and stocks and a border of the cornflowers she loved. And she learned to sleep upon her own side of the vast bed, without any longer hoping that the other side would one day be filled. She also began, though she scarcely admitted it to herself, to prepare a way out. On the far edge of the estate stood the dower house, a modest and pretty place of gray stone that had belonged to Gabriel's late grandmother and had stood empty since. Cordelia told Mrs. Thistlewood that the house wanted airing, that it was a shame to let so fine a little house fall into ruin, and that she wished to see it set to rights. This was true. It was also not the whole of the truth. In the secret rooms of her heart she was making herself a refuge, a place to which she might one day retreat and live out a quiet and separate life. She had not yet decided to go, but the thought of going had begun to live inside her like a second and steadier heartbeat. The third month of the marriage brought a subtle shift, though it began not with Cordelia, but with Gabriel. How was a man much occupied that season with the affairs of the county, and with a great deal of anxious correspondence concerning the state of the money markets, for the whole of England had grown feverish with speculation, and there were dark rumors running through the city. Absorbed in these matters, he began almost against his will to notice small absences in his household. The sprig of rosemary no longer appeared upon his desk in the mornings. The little volume of poetry had gone from the table by his chair. His wife no longer came down to breakfast with that expectant and painful light in her eyes. She came in, certainly. She ate her toast with perfect composure and inquired politely whether he had slept well, and then she went about her day and did not linger and did not ask for tea and did not seek his company at all. At first, he told himself that this was a relief. The pretense between them was ended, and an ending, however cold, was cleaner than the daily small performance of a courtship that neither of them meant. But relief has a way of curdling. He found as the days went on that the silence he had wanted had begun to trouble him. One evening he returned late from a meeting of the county magistrates and walked past the east wing on his way to his rooms, and he saw a thin blade of candlelight beneath the library door. He paused. He could not have said why. Through the gap he saw Cordelia curled in a great armchair, with a book open in her lap and a shawl about her shoulders, and there was upon her face a look of such quiet and untroubled peace that he did not recognize it. He had never once seen his wife look so. He had seen her composed, and he had seen her wounded, and he had seen her carefully cheerful across a breakfast table, but he had never seen her at ease. When he wondered, standing in the dark corridor like a thief in his own house, had she stopped looking wounded? When had she stopped looking at him at all? He did not go in. He went to his own cold room and lay awake a long while, and he was annoyed with himself for lying awake, and more annoyed still that he could not say precisely why. He had married her. He told himself in the dark, believing a thing that every fact before him had seemed to confirm. Crane had laid it out plainly enough in those anxious weeks before the wedding. The debt was real and ruinous, and old Ashcombe held it, and Ashcombe would call it and turn 100 tenant families off the land unless the Earl of Ravensmere did the one thing that would tie the two houses together and stay the baronet's hand. Gabriel had been a proud man and an angry one, and he had gone to the altar hating the girl who stood beside him in her ivory silk, hating her the more because she looked so soft and so hopeful and so entirely undeserving of hate, for that softness had seemed to him the very cleverest part of the trap. He had built his whole understanding of his marriage upon that certainty, and now, lying awake in the cold, he found that a single glimpse of a woman reading peacefully by candlelight had set the first small crack running through it, and he did not know how to make the crack close again. The first true crack in his indifference came on a Sunday afternoon in the village. I had ridden out to inspect a low field by the river that the spring rains had flooded, and on his way home he came upon a small crowd gathered near the market cross. He drew rein at a little distance, unwilling to be drawn into whatever village matter had collected them. And then he saw in the center of the crowd his wife. Cordelia was kneeling in the dirt of the road. A small boy of perhaps 6 years had fallen and torn his knee upon the stones, and he was howling, and his mother stood by wringing her hands and unable to quiet him. Cordelia's pale blue day dress was smeared with mud at the hem, and her bonnet had slipped askew, and she seemed not to have noticed either. She was cleaning the boy's knee with her own handkerchief, and she was talking to him in a low and steady voice as she worked. "There now, you are very brave," Gabriel heard her say. "Braver than I was, I promise you. I once fell from a pony and cried for a whole hour together, and I was a great deal older than you. You are doing far better than ever I did." The boy hiccuped and stared at her, and despite himself gave a wet and wobbling laugh. Cordelia smiled at him as though he had done something marvelous, and she pressed her handkerchief into his mother's hand and murmured some instruction about a salve of calendula, and she told the woman to send up to the house if the knee grew hot or angry. Gabriel sat his horse and watched unseen, and something turned over painfully behind his ribs. This was not the scheming climber of his imagination. This was not the cold conspirator who had trapped him into marriage for a title and a fortune. This was a young woman who would kneel in the mud of a public road for a stranger's weeping child and think nothing of her ruined gown. He wheeled his horse and rode away before she could catch sight of him, and he was unsettled the whole way home, and he was irritated beyond reason to find himself so unsettled. That night at dinner, he looked at her more than once across the length of the table. She did not look at him at all. A week later, they were engaged to dine at the house of Lord and Lady Marrow, a genial couple whose table was the pleasantest in the neighborhood, and it was there that the first true blow fell upon Gabriel, though it fell so softly that he did not at first know he had been struck. Cordelia, withdrawn as she now was from her husband's orbit, still performed her social duties with a grace that drew every eye. She wore a gown of dusky rose that evening, and her dark hair was dressed with a string of small seed pearls, and she carried the conversation at her end of the table with a quiet and unforced intelligence that surprised the company. Gabriel, seated in the place of honor at Lady Marrow's right, found his attention drifting again and again toward the far end of the board. She did not once look toward him. He was quite sure of it. He watched, and she did not. Across from Cordelia sat a gentleman named Edmund Fairley, the second son of a respectable family, a man of about 30 who had served with distinction at Waterloo and carried himself with the easy modesty of one who has seen a great deal and needs to prove nothing. He was pleasant to look upon, and pleasanter still to listen to, and he had turned the whole of his gentle attention upon Cordelia. He asked her what she had been reading. He asked her opinion of it, and he listened to the answer as though it were the most natural thing in the world that a woman should have an opinion, and that a man should wish to hear it. Cordelia, who had not been asked for her opinion of anything in 3 months, answered him, and then Fairley said something that made her laugh. Gabriel could not hear the whole of what passed between them, but he heard enough. He heard Fairley ask her whether she did not find the new poetry too much given over to feeling, and he heard Cordelia answer that she thought a little feeling no bad thing in a poem or in anything else, and that she would rather a book that felt too much than one that felt nothing at all. She said it lightly, but Gabriel felt the small blade of it turn in him, for he knew very well which of them at that table felt nothing or had schooled himself to seem as though he did. And then Fairley had laughed and said something in return, and Cordelia had laughed too. It was the laugh that undid Gabriel. It was soft and surprised and wholly genuine, a sound he had never once drawn from her in all the days of their marriage, and it landed upon him like a blow to the chest. Jealousy, when it came, did not come as a hot and violent thing. It came as a slow and creeping poison. He watched Fairley lean a little nearer to point out some jest upon her dessert plate. He watched her lips curve. He watched the way her shoulders, which went rigid and careful whenever he himself came near her, had relaxed into an ease he had forgotten she possessed. And through the whole of that long dinner, his wife did not glance toward him a single time. The carriage ride home was silent, but it was a different silence than the ones he had grown used to. This one was charged and heavy. Gabriel stared out the window at the dark hedgerows sliding by. Cordelia sat opposite with her gloved hands folded in her lap, her face serene and remote, and her very serenity enraged him because he could not touch it, and because he had begun to understand that he was the one thing in her life that could not. "You seem to enjoy Mr. Fairley's company," he said at last, and the words came out sharper than he had intended. She turned her head slightly. He was very kind. Kind. He repeated the word as though it were foreign to him. "Yes, my lord." He asked what I had been reading, and he did not seem to mind that I had thoughts about it. There was no accusation in her voice. It was a plain statement of a plain fact, and yet it fell upon him like the flick of a whip. "I do not mind your thoughts," he said. She looked at him, then truly looked for the first time in a long while, and her eyes held something ancient and tired. "You have never asked to hear them," she said. The carriage rolled on in silence, and Gabriel found he had no answer because it was true. He had never asked. In 3 months, he had never once wished to know what his wife thought about anything at all. And now, watching her slip a little further from him with every passing day, he began to feel the cold and definite shape of a future he had built entirely with his own hands. After that night, Cordelia's distance deepened. She no longer even pretended to wait for him in the evenings. She breakfasted early often before he came down and took long solitary walks in the gray mornings. She spent more and more of her afternoons at the dower house on the far edge of the estate, overseeing the airing of its rooms and the beating of its old carpets. And though she told the servants she was merely restoring the place, she had begun in truth to imagine herself living in it. It was during one of those afternoons of restoration that Cordelia found the thing that changed the whole course of her life. The dower house had a small muniment room, a windowless closet lined with shelves where the old estate papers had been stored and long neglected. Josiah Crane, who ought to have kept such records in good order, had let the boxes there gather dust and disarray, for he had no use for the past and less patience for tidiness that no one would reward. Cordelia, who could not bear disorder and who had grown fond of the quiet work of setting things right, obtained the housekeeper's leave to sort through the muddle. She thought only to make the little room fit for use. She had worked through the better part of a box of yellowed leases and receipted bills when her fingers closed upon a document that made her go quite still. It was a bond, a promise to pay a very large sum, and it bore the name of Gabriel Thorne as the debtor and the mark of a provincial banking house, Wexford and Slade, and it was made over by a line of endorsement upon its back to Sir Reginald Ashcombe. It was, she understood at once, the very paper that had ruined her life. This was the debt. This was the trap that her father had supposedly sprung upon her husband, the leash that had dragged Gabriel to the altar. She held in her 2 hands the instrument of her own disgrace. She might have wept over it. Instead, being who she was, she read it. Cordelia had spent a portion of her girlhood keeping her father's accounts in the years before his fortunes failed, copying his correspondence in a fair hand and reconciling his ledgers, and she had a clerk's eye for the look of a document. And the more she studied the bond, the more it troubled her. The bank's seal was pressed into the wax at the foot of it, and she knew that seal for the Ashcombes had once banked at a house allied to Wexford and Slade. And she was almost certain that this device, this particular arrangement of the bank's arms, was not the one that had been in use in the year the bond purported to be signed. It was a newer stamp. She had seen it upon a receipt not 2 years old. It could not honestly appear upon a paper dated 4 years before. And there was the signature. Her father's hand endorsed the back of the bond, and it was a good imitation of her father's hand, but it was an imitation. Cordelia had copied out her father's letters 100 times. She knew the particular way he crossed his letters and the little flourish he made upon the final stroke of his name. And this signature had the flourish in the wrong place. As a forger makes it, who has studied a signature but never watched the hand that writes it. She sat back upon her heels in the dusty little room, the bond trembling slightly in her fingers, and a thought came to her that was so large and so cold that she could scarcely hold it. The debt was a forgery. The trap that had bound her and Gabriel together and poisoned them both against one another had never been real at all. Someone had made it. Someone had built the whole cruel machine of their misery out of ink and wax and a stolen signature. But who and why? She did not yet know. But for the first time in 3 long months, Cordelia Thorne was not merely a woman being done to. She had a question and she meant to answer it. She told no one. She copied out in her careful clerk's hand every particular of the bond, the sum, and the date, and the description of the seal. And she wrote a letter that same evening to Mr. Ambrose Pruitt, a London solicitor who had managed the small affairs of her mother's family for many years and who had always been kind to her. She framed the letter as a matter of tenant charity, a question about an old lease and the proper form of a bank's endorsement, so that no one glancing at it would think anything of it. But her true questions were buried in it, plain enough for Pruitt to find. When had the seal of Wexford and Slade last been changed? Was there any register by which the endorsement of a bond might be traced to the person who had truly bought it? She sealed the letter and gave it to a trusted stable boy to carry to the post at the market town, and then she went back to Ravensmere Court and sat down to dinner across from her husband and said nothing at all. It was in the middle of that same fraught week that Cordelia came to understand another thing entirely, and this one turned her careful courage to fear. She had been unwell for some days, wearied by mornings and turned by certain smells, and given to a strange lightness in her head. Mrs. Thistlewood, who missed very little, looked at her one morning with a soft and knowing sort of pity, and asked very gently whether her ladyship might not wish to see the doctor. Cordelia did see him, and his quiet words left her sitting alone in her chamber a long while afterward, with her hands pressed flat against her middle. She was with child. The child could only have been begun on one single night. 2 months into their marriage, Gabriel had come to her once and only once, late and unsteady after a great deal of brandy, driven by some lonely ache that he never named and never explained. He had been gentle in the darkness, almost tender, and she had lain afterward in the dark, daring to hope that something had changed. But in the gray of the morning, he had been colder than she had ever seen him, as though ashamed of his own weakness, and he had not touched her since, nor spoken of it, nor met her eyes across a table for days. Now a small life grew beneath her heart, and she had not the least idea how to tell its father. Worse than not knowing was fearing. She was very sure of what she feared. She feared that Gabriel would look at the child as he looked at her as one more link in the chain her family had forged to bind him. She feared he would count it another move in a game she had never played. The thought of it made her ill, more ill than the child itself did. And so she resolved to say nothing yet, not until she was certain of what she meant to do. The dower house, which had been a vague dream of retreat, took on now a sharper and more urgent shape. She would go there. She would have the child in peace, away from the cold breakfasts and the averted eyes, and she would love it enough for two. Yet even in her fear, there was a fierce and secret gladness that she could not entirely put down. Whatever else the child was, whatever danger or grief it might bring, it was hers. It would be a creature in the world that belonged to her, and to whom she belonged, and after 3 months of being a stranger in her own house, the thought of it warmed some cold place in her that she had thought would never be warm again. She laid her hand upon her middle in the quiet of her room and made the child a promise that whatever came, it would never for 1 hour of its life be made to feel that it was not wanted. She had learned too well what that felt like. She would not pass it on. She threw herself into the preparation of it with a new and secret purpose, and she waited for Mr. Pruitt's reply, and she moved through the days at Ravensmere Court, like a woman walking a rope over a great drop, upright and careful, and entirely alone. Gabriel, meanwhile, was quietly coming apart, though he would not have called it that. I had begun to notice everything about her that he had spent 3 months refusing to see. He noticed the way she spoke to the head gardener, and how she remembered the names of the man's children, and asked after the one who had been poorly. He noticed that she had declined an invitation to a ball in town on the grounds that she did not wish to be a trouble to his lordship's evening, and the small, bitter courtesy of it stung him more than any reproach could have done. He noticed that she no longer wore the cornflower blue that had once suited her so well, and that she had taken instead to soft grays and lavenders, colors that made her look like a woman fading gently out of a room. He found himself inventing reasons to pass the East Wing library when she was in it. He would go in on the pretense of seeking some volume he did not want, and he would find her there among her books, and he would stand a moment too long before retreating. He saw upon the little table in her sitting room, when he passed its open door, a piece of half-finished needlework, an intricate small pattern of wildflowers worked in the palest thread, and he wondered for whom she stitched it, and the wondering gnawed at him. He saw a letter upon the hall table addressed to her in a bold masculine hand, and a flare of possessive fury went through him before he learned that it was from her brother Theodore, a boy of 16. He was ashamed of the fury, and he did not know what to do with the shame. What tormented him most was not the fear that she loved another man, for in his heart he did not truly believe that she did. What tormented him was the plain fact that another man had given her in a few short weeks of ordinary kindness all the things that he, her husband, had withheld from her for months. Fairly asked her what she thought, fairly listened when she spoke, fairly made her laugh. These were not grand things. They cost nothing. Any husband in England might have given them freely to his wife across a breakfast table, and Gabriel had given none of them, and now he watched another man give them, and was eaten alive by the watching. He began to understand slowly and with a mounting horror that he had not been robbed of anything. He had thrown it away with both hands every day for 3 months, and only now that another had stooped to pick it up did he see what it had been worth. The jealousy that had begun as a slow poison became a gnawing and constant hunger. He watched Edmund fairly now at every gathering where their paths crossed, and he catalogued each word the man spoke to Cordelia and each smile she gave in return. At a garden party at Merrow Hall, he saw Fairley place a small volume of poetry into Cordelia's hands, and he saw their fingers brush as she took it, and he saw her tuck the little book into her reticule with a smile of genuine pleasure. The edges of Gabriel's vision went red. He said nothing there among the roses and the lemonade and the watching county. But that evening he came to her sitting room, and he did not knock. Cordelia looked up from the poetry book, startled as the door opened. "What is Mr. Fairley to you?" Gabriel said. She set the book down slowly. "I beg your pardon, my lord." "Fairley, he put a book into your hands today before half the county. He is forever at your elbow. I will have an answer." Cordelia rose from her chair, and there was in the movement a quiet dignity he had not seen in her before, a straightening of the spine that seemed to cost her nothing. "Mr. Fairley is a friend," she said. "He has shown me kindness at a time when I have had very little of it from any quarter. He has never once spoken a word to me that he might not have spoken before you, and I have given him no encouragement beyond my gratitude for being treated as though I were alive." "Gratitude!" Gabriel said, and the word came out like a sneer, though the sneer was aimed, had he known it, at himself. "You are the Countess of Ravensmere. You do not accept gifts from other men." "Do I not?" She lifted her chin. Her eyes were very bright. "And what would you have me do instead, my lord? Sit in silence in a house where my husband cannot bear to look at me? Wait through the evenings for a companion who never comes? Mr. Fairley asks after my day. He listens when I speak. He does not look through me as though I were the wallpaper. I have been a ghost in this house for 3 months. You made me one. Do not stand there now and rage that some living man has finally noticed I am not yet dead." And then she said, the thing that changed everything, the thing she had held so carefully and so long, and she said it not as a plea, but as a blow because she was done pleading. "You believe my father held a debt over you." She said, her voice low and steady and terrible. "You have believed it since the day we married, and you have punished me for it every day since. But I never knew of any debt, my lord, not until the night I heard you say it through your own study window. My father lied to me as he lied to you. And now I have seen the paper itself, the very bond that was used to bring you to the altar, and I tell you plainly that I believe it is a forgery. The seal is wrong. The signature is false. Someone made that debt out of nothing and used it to ruin us both, and it was not I." The words struck Gabriel like a physical thing. He opened his mouth and found that no sound came. He stared at her, at the trembling brightness of her, at the fury and the grief that had been sealed up in her all this while and were pouring out of her now in the plain light of the candles. And for the first time he saw the true depth of the wound he had dealt her. He saw the hope that had withered in her. He saw the loneliness that had grown in its place. He saw a woman who had loved him once, who had worn his favorite color to a ball where he would not look at her, and who had at last, and quite finally, given up. "Cordelia," he began, and his voice was not steady. But she had already turned away from him, her shoulders shaking, her hand pressed to her mouth. "Please leave me," she said. "I am very tired." He left, and the closing of the door behind him felt to him like the reading out of a verdict, and he was the prisoner in the dock, and the verdict was guilty. The days that followed were a slow and agonizing awakening. Gabriel moved through his own house like a man in a fever. He turned her words over and over in his mind. "I never knew of any debt. My father lied to me as he lied to you. I believe it is a forgery." He wanted to dismiss them. It would have been easier and cleaner and less painful to set them aside as the clever defense of a clever woman caught out at last. But he could not. He had seen her kneel in the mud of the road for a stranger's child. He had heard her laugh once with another man, the laugh she had never given him. He had watched her build a whole small good life out of the ruins he had left her, without complaint and without malice, tending his tenants and teaching herself the uses of herbs and setting an old dead house to rights. That was not the conduct of a schemer. He had been so certain of her guilt that he had never troubled to test it. Now that he troubled, it would not hold. He went at last to the one place he had never thought to look. He went to the estate papers. Josiah Crane kept the ledgers and the records of the Ravensmere estates in a great cabinet in the steward's room, and Gabriel had never in his life had cause to examine them closely. For Crane was his man trusted past question, a fixture of the house since Gabriel's boyhood. But he examined them now. He sat far into the night with the account books open before him, and he traced the great confused history of the debts that had hung over the estate in the year of his marriage, and the more he traced them, the less they made sense. The numbers did not agree with one another. Sums appeared and vanished. Payments were recorded to persons unnamed. And running through all of it half-hidden was the thread of a story quite different from the one he had been told. I was still bent over the ledgers when the letter came from London that broke the case wide open, and it did not come to him. It came to his wife. Mr. Ambrose Prewitt had done his work well. In a long and careful reply, he answered every question Cordelia had buried in her letter, and he answered more. Besides, for the questions had roused the old solicitor's curiosity, and he had followed the scent a good deal further than she had dared to ask. The seal of Wexford and Slade, he confirmed, had indeed been altered, and the device upon the bond she had described could not have been in use before a date well after the bond was supposedly signed. The paper was false, and Prewitt wrote, having grown suspicious, he had made certain quiet inquiries into the buying up of Sir Reginald Ashcombe's genuine debts, of which there were sadly many, and he had traced them through an agent and a second agent and a screen of borrowed names to a single purchaser. The purchaser was Mr. Percival Thorne. Cordelia read the name and felt the whole shape of the thing fall suddenly into place, as the last piece of a puzzle shows you the picture entire. Percival Thorne was Gabriel's cousin. More than that, and this was the heart of it, Percival Thorne was Gabriel's heir. The title and the great estate of Ravensmere were entailed bound by law to pass to the nearest male of the Thorne blood, and Gabriel had no brother and no son. If Gabriel died without a son, everything the earldom and the court and the broad Somerset acres would fall to Percival. It had always been so. It had always been until now a distant and unremarkable fact. But Percival, it seemed, had grown tired of waiting upon distance and chance, and so he had built himself a certainty. He had quietly bought up the ruined Sir Reginald's debts until he held the man entirely in his grip. He had forged a bond in Gabriel's name and put Sir Reginald's endorsement upon it and used it through the whispering mouth of some servant to persuade Gabriel that the only way to save his tenants from ruin was to marry the daughter of the man who held his paper. He had at the same time forced the desperate Sir Reginald to tell his daughter the opposite tale that the Earl asked for her out of long and tender love. He had made of the marriage a poisoned thing from its very first hour, a union of two people, each believing the other, a party to a trap, so that no warmth could ever grow between them, and no child would ever come to stand between Percival Thorne and all that he desired. And now Cordelia thought her hand going involuntarily to her middle. Now there was a child. If it were a son, it would end Percival's every hope. She had thought her secret was a private grief. She saw now that it was to a certain kind of man a mortal threat. She and the small life within her were in far more danger than she had understood. She sat a long while with Prewitt's letter in her lap and let the cold truth of it settle into her. There was beneath her fear a strange and steadying clarity. For 3 months, she had been a woman to whom things were done, a piece moved about a board by hands she could not see. Now she could see the hand. It had a name and a face and a reason, and reasons can be undone as surely as they are made. She was no longer merely enduring, she was hunting. And she found somewhat to her own surprise that she was very good at it. That all those years of copying her father's ledgers and setting his tangled affairs to rights had made of her exactly the sort of patient, careful, unfrightened person who could follow a false shilling through a maze of borrowed names to the pocket it had come from. Percival Thorne had built his whole scheme upon the certainty that the young wife he had trapped was too soft and too foolish and too powerless to be any danger to him. It was, Cordelia thought grimly, the only real mistake he had made, and she meant to make him pay dearly for it. She had scarcely finished the letter, and scarcely begun to reckon with all that it meant when the outer world chose that very week to catch fire. The rumors that had run through the city all that season came suddenly and horribly true. In the December of that year, the whole edifice of English credit began to fall. Provincial banks that had lent too freely and printed too many notes found their coffers empty when their frightened customers came clamoring for gold, and one by one they shut their doors. Panic ran from town to town like fire through dry gorse. Wexford and Slade, the very house whose forged seal lay at the bottom of Cordelia's ruin, was among the first of the provincial banks to fall, and its failure threw all of its papers, its false ones with its true ones, into the hands of assignees and lawyers who now had every reason to sort the real from the counterfeit. And it was into this chaos that Percival Thorne made his final move. He came down to Somerset. He came ostensibly as a concerned kinsman, but he came in truth because the collapse of Wexford and Slade had frightened him, and a frightened schemer grows reckless. He knew that the failed bank's papers would soon be examined by clever and disinterested men. He needed the forged bond called in and settled and buried before anyone thought to look at it closely. And so he pressed Gabriel with every appearance of family feeling to honor the old debt at once and quietly to raise the great sum and clear the paper and be done with it before the general ruin swallowed them all. He hinted, too, at other and darker measures. He spoke with a lawyer's cold relish of the Court of Chancery, of how a suit once entered there might drag on for years and swallow a fortune in costs and blacken a family's name past cleaning. And he let it be understood that he had it in his power to enter such a suit and to name the Countess in it, and to make of her supposed conspiracy with her father a public and endless scandal unless Gabriel did as he was bid. I believed he held every card. He did not know that his cousin's wife had spent 3 quiet months learning to read the deck. Sir Reginald, far away and stricken by the collapse and by his own long guilt, wrote at last a letter of full confession, setting down all that he had done and all that Percival had made him do, and sent it flying toward Somerset. But it would arrive too late to be the thing that saved them, and Cordelia had never meant to be saved by anyone's confession but the truth's. She had done the work. She had found the flaw in the wax and the falseness in the hand. She had traced the money to its source, and now with the enemy come down into her own country and grown careless in his fear, she chose her moment and she made her stand. She did not go to Gabriel and beg him to believe her. She had done with begging. Instead, she arranged a reckoning, and she arranged it so that it could not be denied. She wrote to Mr. Pruitt and bid him come down from London at once and bring with him the affidavits he had gathered and the record now public of the Wexford and Slade seals and the dates of their use. She sent word through Mrs. Thistlewood that the Earl and Mr. Percival Thorne and the steward Josiah Crane were all three to attend her in the great library of Ravensmere Court upon a matter touching the honor of the family, and she framed the summons in such a way that not one of the three could refuse it without seeming to fear it. And upon the appointed evening, with the December wind moaning at the tall windows and the fire throwing its uneasy light across the old books, Cordelia Thorne walked into that room to face them all, and she was quite calm, and she carried in her hands the papers that would end it. Gabriel was there watchful and grim, not yet knowing what his wife intended. Percival was there smooth and smiling, certain of his ground. Crane stood a little apart by the door, soft and attentive as ever. And Mr. Pruitt, gray and dry and precise, stood at Cordelia's side with his leather case of documents. Cordelia laid the forged bond upon the great library table where all could see it. Beside it, she laid a genuine receipt of Wexford and Slade, one of recent date that she had drawn from the estate papers, and beside that she laid the sworn statement of the bank's own former clerk procured by Pruitt, describing when the seal upon the receipt had first come into use. "This bond," she said, and her voice was clear and it did not shake, "is the paper by which my husband was persuaded that my father held him to ransom, and by which he was brought to a marriage he did not want, and by which he was taught to despise a wife who had done him no wrong. I have called you here to show you that it is a lie from the first stroke to the last." She set her finger upon the seal at the foot of the bond. "This is the seal of Wexford and Slade, but it is the new seal, the one the bank did not begin to use until 3 years after the date this bond claims to bear. A true bond of that year would carry the old device. Mr. Pruitt has the sworn word of the bank's own clerk as to when the change was made. No honest hand could have pressed this seal upon a paper of this date, for the seal did not yet exist." Percival's smile had begun to stiffen at the corners. "And this," she went on, turning the bond over, "is my father's endorsement by which the debt was made over to him. It is a good copy of his hand. But it is a copy. I kept my father's books for 6 years, sirs, and I know his signature as I know my own, and whoever wrote this had seen the name, but had never seen the man write it, for the final flourish is made backward. It is a forgery, and I will swear to it before any court in England." She lifted her eyes then, and she looked full at Percival Thorne. "There remained only the question of who had made it and why. Mr. Pruitt has answered the first. Every genuine debt my poor father owed was bought up in the space of a single year through hired agents and false names by one man, and the trail of that money followed patiently enough leads to a single door. It is your door, Mr. Thorne." The room had gone very still. The fire snapped. Gabriel had risen slowly to his feet. "As to the why," Cordelia said, "any child could reason it. My husband has no son. Should he die without one, the whole of Ravensmere passes by the entail to his nearest kinsman. To you. You did not choose to leave so great a matter to the ordinary chances of the years. You forged a debt and built a loveless marriage and set husband and wife against one another so that no child should ever come to bar your way. And when at last this season you learned that a child was coming after all, you came down into this house to frighten and to threaten and to force the burying of your forgery before the failure of the bank should lay it bare. You have overreached, sir. The bank has failed, and its papers are in honest hands now, and the truth of your seal is a matter of public record. You are undone." Percival's smooth face had gone the color of tallow. He looked from the bond to the solicitor to his cousin, and he saw in all three faces the closing of every door. "This is a fantasy," he said, but his voice had lost its silk. "A woman's fantasy. You cannot prove a word of it." "I can prove all of it," said Mr. Pruitt quietly, "and I shall before a jury if it comes to that. And I will remind you, Mr. Thorne, that the forging of such an instrument is not a matter of ruined reputation only. It is a capital felony. Men have gone to the gallows this year for less. Gabriel had listened to the whole of it, standing very still, and now he spoke for the first time, and his voice was low and dangerous and cold, in a way that Cordelia had heard before, but never turned in this direction. "You did this," he said to his cousin. "You bought a family's ruin and forged my name and set a servant in my own house to whisper poison in my ear. You made me despise a woman who had done me no wrong. You took 3 months of both our lives, and you would have taken far more. And you did it for a title and a house that you had not the patience to wait for." He drew a slow breath. "I have never in my life wished a man dead, Percival. I find that I wish it now." The word gallows fell into the room like a stone into a still pond, and it was that word and not any of Cordelia's proofs that broke Percival Thorne at last. He was a schemer, not a brave man, and he had built his whole plot upon the certainty that no one would ever look closely at his lie. Now, everyone was looking. He made no further denial. He looked once wildly at the door, and Crane, reading his master's ruin in an instant, and thinking only of his own neck, shrank back and would not meet his eye. And in that small treachery, Percival read the collapse of everything. He turned and went from the room without another word, and within the week he had fled the country altogether, gone abroad, to live out his days as a man does who dares not come home, and he troubled the house of Ravensmere no more. Josiah Crane, the trusted man, the whisperer at Gabriel's ear, who had taken Percival's coin to poison a marriage from within, was dismissed from the estate that same night, and turned out of the only home he had known for 20 years, and if that was a smaller justice than his treachery had earned, it was justice enough, and Gabriel could not bear the sight of him a moment longer. And then the room was empty of all but the two of them, the Earl and his Countess, and the fire and the truth at last laid bare between them. Gabriel came slowly around the great table. He looked at the false bond lying upon it, the little scrap of ink and wax that had cost them both so dearly. And then he looked at his wife, who stood very straight and very pale in the firelight, with the whole of her long ordeal finished at last. "You did this," he said, and his voice was hoarse. "While I sat in silence and nursed my grievance like a fool, while I punished you for a crime that was worked upon us both, you found the truth. You saved my tenants and my name and the child in me. You saved me, Cordelia, and I gave you nothing but cold to do it with." He did not stop there. He did the thing that no one who had known the cold Earl of Ravensmere would ever have believed him capable of. He went down upon his knees before her, there upon the library floor, and he took her hand in both of his and pressed it to his bowed forehead. "I read you all wrong," he said. "From the very first hour I read you all wrong, and I let a lie a servant whispered do the reading for me, and I never once had the courage or the decency to ask you the truth. You left rosemary on my desk, and I ignored it. You knelt in the mud for a stranger's child, while I called you a schemer in my heart. You loved me, and I threw it into the fire. I do not ask you to forgive it, for I cannot think how you should. I ask only for the chance to spend the rest of my life earning what I threw away." Cordelia's composure, which had held through the whole terrible reckoning, broke now, and the tears came silently and fast. "I did love you," she said. "I loved you for 4 years before ever you married me, and I loved you through every cold breakfast after. But I cannot live on courtesy, Gabriel. I cannot raise a child in a house where I am not wanted. I found the truth of the bond, so that you would know I was no schemer. I did not find it so that you would love me. I had given up hoping for that." "Then let me hope for both of us," he said. He lifted his head and looked up at her, and his eyes, which she had only ever seen cold, were wet. "I am not asking because of the child, though God knows I want the child more than I want my next breath. I am asking because somewhere in these 3 months, while I watched you slip further from me, every day I fell in love with my own wife, slowly and completely, and far too late. I think I began to love you on the very afternoon you stopped loving me, when I saw you laugh with another man and understood at last what I had thrown away. That is the whole bitter joke of it. You gave up, and only then did I open my eyes." A sound escaped her that was half a sob and half something else, something with the faint, fragile edge of hope upon it. "I never truly stopped," she whispered. "I only buried it so that I could go on living." "Then let me dig it up again," he said, "one careful handful at a time. Let me be a husband who asks what you are reading and listens to the answer. Let me learn the names of every tenant's child, as you have done. Let me read poetry with you by the fire. Do not go to the dower house alone, Cordelia. Let me come with you if you will not stay. Let me be the father this child deserves, and the husband I have not once in 3 months tried to be." She was quiet a long moment. Outside, the wind had dropped, and somewhere in the dark, a late blackbird sang its thin, cold winter song. Then slowly she drew from the little reticule at her wrist a folded twist of paper, and she opened it, and inside lay a sprig of rosemary pressed flat and dry. "Rosemary is for remembrance," she said softly. "I left a sprig on your desk once in the 2nd week of our marriage. You never spoke of it. I pressed this one and kept it so that if you never smiled at me again, at least I would remember that you had smiled at me once long ago at a country dance." She closed his fingers around it. "But you smiled at me tonight. You have smiled at me twice since I came into this room, and I find that is enough to make me stay." For a moment she did not move. She looked down at the dry sprig of rosemary in his hand, and at the bowed, dark head of the man she had loved for so long and against her own better sense, loved still, and she felt all the careful defenses she had built through the cold months waver upon their foundations. She had promised herself she would not do this. She had told herself through every lonely night that she would not let him back into the soft, unguarded center of her where he could hurt her again. But he was weeping, and he had not once wept in all the time she had known him, and the truth was out at last and standing clean between them, and she was so very tired of being alone. He came up off his knees then, and gathered her into his arms with the careful reverence of a man handling something he had once broken and could scarcely believe he was permitted to hold again. And she turned her face into his shoulder, and at last, after 3 long months, she wept without hiding it. All of it came out of her, the loneliness and the rejection and the silent labor and the fear, and he held her through every part of it and murmured into her hair the words she had waited so long to hear. "I am sorry. I am so sorry. You are safe now. I have you." Healing did not come in a single night, and neither of them pretended that it could, but it came. They returned to living under one roof as though they had only just met. And in a sense, they had, for neither had ever truly known the other before. The servants of Ravensmere Court, who had watched the cold months with silent grief, marked the change within a day and rejoiced in it, though they were too well trained to say so. The Earl no longer shut himself away in his study of an evening. He took his breakfast with his Countess and asked her what she meant to do with her day, and listened when she told him. He walked with her in the bare winter garden with her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, and he read aloud to her in the library in the long dark afternoons when the cold made her weary, and slowly the fading gray pallor left her face and a gentle color came back into it. Edmund Fairley, who was a good man and had wished her nothing but well, understood how the land now lay and bowed himself gracefully out of their circle. And Gabriel, in a gesture that surprised even himself, sought the man out and thanked him plainly and sincerely for the kindness he had shown a lonely woman when her own husband had shown her none. For Gabriel had come to see that Fairley's gentle attention had been the mirror in which he first glimpsed his own failures, and that the jealousy which had nearly consumed him had in the end done him the great service of forcing his eyes open. The thing he had hated had helped to save him. He could afford now to be grateful for it. The winter softened toward spring. Sir Reginald's confession, when it arrived, was read and quietly answered, and though Cordelia could not soon forgive the father who had sold her silence to protect himself, she wrote to him with more gentleness than he deserved, for the sake of Theo, whose future was secured, now that the false debts were exposed, and the true ones settled, and who went up to Oxford in his time, and did his sister great credit. The great fear that had hung over the marriage was gone. The enemy had fled. And what remained in the quiet house among the Somerset hills was the slow and patient work of building brick upon careful brick, the thing that ought to have been built from the beginning. There were hard days among the good ones, for so great a wound does not close all at once. There were mornings when Cordelia woke with the old ache of the cold months still upon her, and could not for an hour or two quite believe in the warmth of the new ones, and drew back from him in an instinct she could not help. Gabriel learned in those hours not to press her, but to wait, and to let her come back to him in her own time, and to show by 100 small, unhurried patiences that he was not the man he had been and did not mean to be him again. There were evenings when some careless word of his fell wrong, and she flinched from it, and he saw the flinch and understood what he had built in her, and grieved for it quietly, and began again. She did not make it easy for him, and he did not think that she should, and there was a kind of honesty in that between them that they had never had in the days of their cold civility. Gabriel proved as good as his word, and better. He did not merely apologize and expect the world to be as it had been. He rebuilt the foundation of the marriage stone by stone. He asked her opinion upon the affairs of the estate, and finding it good, took it. He learned to sit with her in a comfortable silence that had no coldness in it at all. He laid his hand upon the gentle swell of her figure as the spring came on, and spoke low and foolish words to the child within, and the wonder upon his face, when he did so, was a thing Cordelia treasured above every jewel in the house. And one evening in early spring, when the first green was misting the hedgerows and the cutting garden behind the conservatory had begun to wake, Gabriel led her out along the gravel path to the little arbor where her cornflowers had first come up the year before, and he stopped there and took both her hands, and he was not quite steady. "I want to ask you something," he said, "not as an earl to his countess, as a man to the woman he loves." She looked up at him, her heart so full it ached. "Yes." "Will you stand with me in the village chapel," he said, "and let the vicar bless us and say our vows over again, the ones we said at St. James's in coldness and in lies? I want to say them to you in truth this time. I want to hear you say them back to me, knowing you have every right in the world to refuse." The tears blurred her sight, but she was smiling through them. "We are already married," she said. "We were bound in a lie," he answered. "I want to be bound to you in the truth. That is a different thing, and I find I cannot rest until it is done." She laughed then, a bright and unburdened sound, the very laugh he had once heard her give another man and had thought he would never earn. "Yes, Gabriel," she said, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her there, beneath the bare arbor, gently and with great reverence, and it tasted to them both of a beginning. The blessing was said a fortnight later in the small stone chapel of the village, with only a handful of witnesses to see it, and those the ones that mattered. Mrs. Thistlewood was there, and the cook whose daughter Cordelia had nursed through her fever, and the old head gardener, and brought scrubbed and shining in his Sunday best by his proud mother the small boy whose torn knee Cordelia had bound up in the mud of the market road so long before. Cordelia wore the cornflower blue gown that she had put away in grief, and when Gabriel saw her come up the aisle in it, his eyes were bright with tears he did not trouble to hide. They spoke their vows quietly, their hands clasped together, and this time every word of them was true. That spring, as the orchards came into blossom, a daughter was born to them, a small and perfect creature, with her mother's eyes blue as cornflowers after rain. They named her Aurora for the dawn, because it seemed to them both that the darkest chapters of their lives had led them at the last into a morning brighter than either had dared to hope for. Gabriel held his wife in the still hours after the birth, their daughter nestled sleeping between them, and he said to her the words he would go on saying every day of the years that followed. "You are the heart of this house," he said. "You are the love I very nearly lost through my own blindness. I shall spend the whole of my life trying to be worthy of you." Cordelia, weary and radiant, lifted her hand and touched his cheek. "You already are," she said. And so the Earl and Countess of Ravensmere came to learn that love could take root even in the most barren and frozen ground, if only it were tended with humility and with patience, and with the plain courage to speak the things that ought never to be left so long unspoken. The dower house on the edge of the estate was not abandoned. It became in later years a small and cherished sanctuary, a place where the two of them would sometimes walk out together on a fine afternoon and take their tea and remember without bitterness now how near they had come to losing everything, and how the finding of one small forged paper by one quiet and determined woman had turned their long, cold winter into spring. The whispers in the ballrooms of London changed in time as whispers do. No longer did the fans flutter over the tale of the cold earl and his unwanted bride. Now the talk was of the Countess of Ravensmere, the clever and gentle woman who had unraveled a wicked cousin's plot with her own two hands and saved her husband's name and lands, and of the earl who had come so close to throwing her away and had spent every day since making up for it. And whenever anyone was so bold as to ask Cordelia herself whether she did not regret those first bitter months of her marriage, she would only look across the room toward her husband, who would be reading in the firelight with their daughter, asleep against his shoulder, and she would smile. "I would endure it all again," she would say, "every cold hour of it for this." And that she had come to understand was the truest kind of healing there was.